why has growth eluded the middle class? What characteristics of it are such that it's not trickling down into the middle and helping typical family wages grow?
Well, there's a lot of reasons, and Jared sort of alluded to some of them, why we haven't seen the kind of broad-based prosperity that we saw in previous decades, certainly before before the 1970s. One place I want to start, though, is that, as Jared said, we've just lived through a period where we've seen too much debt, right? But it wasn't too much debt necessarily among governments. We saw too much debt among individual households. So as the housing bubble sort of, increased, you saw people taking on increasing amounts of debt, and you saw especially middle class and upper middle class families, across the income spectrum, taking on this debt, which in no small part was a part of the crisis. But I think we need to be thinking really seriously about why we got into this situation, right? And so some of the story is about the availability of credit. Some of the story, I think, is about the way that families coped with the declining wages or the lack of wage growth that they'd seen in the decades leading up to the crisis. So when you don't have a lot of income growth and you have a lot of access to credit, you've got a bit of a perfect storm there. So this question of why families and workers are not benefiting from where growth is going today isn't a new question. It's one that we've been dealing with, quite frankly, for decades. So what we just lived through is families dealing with it through debt. What we lived through before that, and we're still sort of dealing with the reverberations from, is families coping by putting in more hours, by having more people participate in the labor force. So that's the first way that families coped with declining wages as you saw the 70s move into the 1980s. So at this point, you've been seeing this for a long time. So I think that kind of saying that this is unique to this recovery really isn't where we need to start our questioning. So why is it that you haven't seen workers benefiting from growth? I'll start that comment by pointing to something that Larry Michel often said, who Jared and I both worked for once long ago, that we continue to live in one of the richest countries in the world, but you see that everywhere except for in the increases in workers' wages. We've seen this huge divergence between what's happened to corporations and productivity and what's happened to workers' wages. So there's a lot of things that go into that, right? We have to think about the policy choices that we've made, from everything to thinking about the real value of the minimum wage, to thinking about our trade policies and our fiscal policy. And we also have to be thinking about the ways that workers have lost their voice at work and what's happened to unions over the past few decades. So there isn't one answer, but I do think that it requires us looking back over time to see what has changed. And I will end by noting that, of course, one of the biggest things to have changed over the past few decades has been this very significant rise in inequality. An inequality that has taken a very peculiar form in that it's, we now know, thanks to this very detailed data that a number of scholars have been putting together, that it's the pulling apart of the top 1%, the very, very top, that has sort of shaped this rise in inequality. So thinking about what that means for economic growth and how that growth isn't trickling down really is one of the most important questions that we need to be tackling moving forward.